In this video, we'll introduce the basics of React. You've probably heard of React before. It's one of the three popular front-end technologies, the other two being Angular and Vue. The first question students often ask is why we cover React instead of Angular or Vue. Before I answer that, let's first look at some statistics and comparisons. So this is NPM trends based on, I guess, number of downloads from NPM, and React is here, and Vue and Angular are down here. Vue and Angular are actually roughly the same. React, as you can see, have been downloaded way more. And this one is Google Trends based on Google searches. And the red one is React. The yellow one in the middle is Angular, and the Vue is a blue one at the bottom. Again, React is quite a bit more popular than both Angular and Vue. And this one is Stack Overflow survey. And this section is the loved, dreaded, and wanted web frameworks, I think. Yeah. ASP.NET Core is actually the most loved of Stack Overflow users. React is number 2, followed by Vue, and Angular is down here. A lot less people love Angular. And this one is an article by somebody comparing React, Angular, and Vue based on a number of things. Most interesting is the job demand part, where you can see on LinkedIn the Angular bar, which is a red bar, and the React bar, which is a blue bar, are, I think, roughly the same. The Vue bar is quite a bit less, and if you look at other job websites, Indeed.com, Simply Hired, Dice, and so on and so forth, again, both Angular and React are roughly the same, a lot less for Vue. There are a bunch of other comparisons. You can take a look when you have time. The bottom line is that overall it looks like Vue is the people's choice, while companies tend to favor React or Angular, probably because React is backed by Facebook and Angular is backed by Google. Between React and Angular, React seems to be the more popular between the two in terms of usage and in terms of developer opinion. So back to the question why we chose React for this class. I usually consider 3 factors for choosing from similar technologies: popularity, job perspective, and the personal experience. Popularity is actually quite important. If a technology is widely used, you know it's probably good. It's probably battle tested in more situations than less used technologies. It's more likely to have good documentation, good support, good online help, and so on. And then for my classes, I also want to cover things that are valued more by companies because, well, I want you guys all find good jobs after you graduate. And last but not least, I also want to teach technologies that I enjoy using. And I did use Angular before, but didn't quite enjoy it. So we thought that React it is. And here's a little bit background about React. It was created by a Facebook engineer, Jordan Walk, and later it became an open source project. Like Angular and Vue, it lets you create self-contained and reusable UI components. React has become so popular that it's now used not just for web, but also for mobile app development and virtual reality development. There's a whole ecosystem around React, providing various functions and features that are not provided by the core React library. Collectively, they are known as the React Stack or React and Friends. In this video, we'll introduce the core library and the JSX language syntax. In the next video, we'll cover one of the React Friends, React routing. Before we talk about React, let's first brush up on the concept of DOM. React is a front-end technology based on client-side JavaScript. That is, JavaScript runs inside a browser. The main purpose of client-side JavaScript is to manipulate web pages. As we know, a web page or a HTML document is just a text file. So one way to manipulate a web page is to treat it as a big string. But as you can imagine, doing so would probably be rather difficult and inefficient. A better way is to represent a web page as an object, and it will be a lot easier to manipulate an object than a big string. This is where the idea of document object model comes from. Document object model, commonly known as DOM, represents HTML documents as objects so they can be processed more easily by programming languages. The object representing this HTML document would look like this. It contains all the elements in the web page. These elements are organized in a tree structure. At the root of the tree is the HTML element. It has two child nodes, head and body. Inside the body, we have a H1 element and a P element. And here they are child nodes of the body node. Each of them also has their own child node, which is a text node containing some text. Because the elements are organized in a tree structure, we often use terms like parent, child, sibling, ancestor, descendants to describe the relationships among nodes/elements. The document object is created by the browser. After a browser loads a web page, it will parse it and create the document object, and we can use it in JavaScript code. Also very importantly, whatever changes we make to the document object will be reflected automatically on the web page. This allows us to manipulate a web page in a nice and easy way by simply changing the document object. React introduces something called virtual DOM. It's an in-memory representation of the UI. React provides a decorative API for you to describe this UI. Decorative in the sense that you describe what the UI should be, and React figure out how to build it and how to update it. Updating the virtual DOM is very efficient because it doesn't involve actually changing the web page. Once changes to the virtual DOM is done, React compares the virtual DOM with the real DOM and uses some clever algorithm to figure out the optimal way to change the real DOM to match the virtual DOM. This process is called reconciliation. To appreciate how React does things, let's consider this example. Suppose we have a form that asks people what programming languages they know. Initially, the form only has one input box, but some people may know more than one programming language, so there's a plus button here if a user clicks this button, we'll add another input box like this. And if they click the button again, we'll add another one, and so on and so forth. Now imagine that you are the programmer who needs to program the event handler for this class button. You could do it the imperative way by manipulating DOM directly. You will need to create a new input element. You will need to find the last input element in the DOM, and then you'll need to insert the new one after it. Or you can do it the decorative way. In React, you basically just need to say increment the number of input elements, and React does the rest for you. So with that, let's see how React really looks like. We'll start with hello world, of course. So first we'll create an HTML page, and let's call it example. And now we need to add a couple of React libraries. So let's go over to here and add these two scripts. And then let's put a div here and give it ID. And ID doesn't really matter what we call it. I'll call it a container. And this div is where we are going to render the React components into. So it's kind of a placeholder or a container element. And then we'll write our code. So we'll put our code here. And the code will look something like this. And here we are going to do get element by ID, and the ID is actually called container here. So let me change this one to container. And let's see. Okay, so it shows hello React. We are getting somewhere. Actually, let me maximize this. So if I change this to 50 to 20, it changes to 50 to 20. Okay, so it is working. Now, let's take a closer look at the code and understand what's going on. So obviously, this one is React, is creating an element. Now, this create element method takes 3 arguments. The first argument is either an HTML element, like a h1 element, or a React component. Here we are just taking a HTML element. And the second argument is an object that used to set properties on this element. And we'll talk more about properties later on. And the third argument is a child. If you have more children of this to this element, you can have more arguments. This is one of the nice things about JavaScript functions. If you remember, you can have as many arguments as you want. You don't have to declare it in a special way. So in this case, we have one child of h1 element, which is a text node, so it displays whatever we wanted to display here. So this creates a React element, and then later on we can render this element in the actual web page, and the place we render it is the div here, so it will render this element inside this container div. Now, if you look at this, you'll say that, okay, it works, but doesn't seem to do a whole lot. All this code, why don't we just create the h1 element directly in there? Well, having one element really is not that useful. What's really useful is to be able to package multiple elements into a reusable component. We can compose a user interface by putting together some UI components. I'm not sure how many of you have done GUI programming using a GUI builder before. If, for example, you've done some Windows GUI programming, or even Java GUI programming, I guess, you may have used a GUI builder before, where a GUI builder will show you a list of GUI components like panels, buttons, labels, and so on, and then you just drag and drop to create a GUI by putting those components together. Same thing for creating user interface for the web. Take, for example, the news website Ars Technica. If you look at this website, you can see that it consists of a number of components. For example, you have a manual component, and then you have some story components, and then you have a different type of story components, and so on, and add components and so on. Each component can have multiple elements or other elements. For example, a story component here has an image, a title, subtitle, author, timestamp, number of comments. And we can create components like this in React. And once a component is created, we can reuse it on the same page, or in the case of a manual component, on different pages, or even on some other projects. Once we have components and once we have reusable components, it becomes a lot more useful. So in React, there are two ways to create components: using class or using function. Class used to be the standard way to create components until React version 16.8, which was released about 2 years ago. Since then, the recommended way is to use function. This is how we can create a component using class. The name of the class is the name of the component, and by convention, it uses Pascal casing. In other words, like in Java class names. Notice that it uses ES6 class syntax. A component class must inherit from the React component class, and it must have a method called render, which returns the elements in the component. Class components are likely to be deprecated in the future. We'll use function components in this class. This is how we can create a component using a function. As we can see, it's quite a bit more concise than the class syntax. The function simply returns the elements in the component, and that's it. Rendering a component on a web page is pretty much the same as rendering any element. We use React DOM render and we use React create element. Notice that in our previous example, we specify an HTML element to create the React element. And in this example, we specify a React component to create the element. And let's see how this works. So here we'll create a function. Again, you'll see that there's an argument here called properties, and later on we'll use it to customize the element in the component. And this one simply returns the elements inside the component, and it contains just a single element h1, and we are also passing on the properties to h1. Later on, again, we are going to do something with it. So once we have that, then we can render this one by doing a React create element, and now the element is called hello React, and we'll pass now as a properties object, meaning that we don't have any properties for it, and we also don't have any additional attributes for additional children for it. So this is how it looks like, and if we run it again, it still works. Again, not doing a whole lot, but now at least we have our first React component called hello React. When we do React development, it's quite important that we have something that lets us examine React components in browser, and this is why it's kind of important that you have the React Developer Tools extension, and this extension is available to both Chrome and Firefox and Edge, which is based on Chrome. So I already have the React Developer Tools installed on my Chrome browser, but this React Developer tool does not work with the file protocol, meaning that if you simply open up the page inside your browser, it loads the page as a file, and the React Developer Tool extension doesn't work with that. So instead, we'll need to start up a HTTP server and use that to serve that page. The easy way to do it is to use the HTTP server package, and this will start a local HTTP server at port 8080. So we don't really need to install this package again. npx is our friend. We'll simply say npx http server. And now it says it's starting up on the local host at port 8080, and it will by default serve the files in the current directory, which include the example.html file. So now instead of using the file protocol, we'll say localhost 8080 example.html. So we see this, but now we can see that the React developer tool is activated. So open up the developer tools of the browser, and there's a new tab here. Two new tabs related to React. The first one is component, and it shows the hello React component, and we have no children and no properties. So okay, and speaking of properties, let's add some properties to our component. Properties are immutable values within an element / a component. Immutable meaning that the values are not supposed to change and they cannot change. Properties are rendered as attributes of the DOM elements, and they can also be used in code. So let's say, for example, we can let's add some properties to the hello React component. For example, here when we render it, let's add 3 properties: ID, name, class name, and name. So class name is basically the class attribute in HTML elements, but because class is a JavaScript keyword, so in React, whenever we want to specify CSS class attribute, we use class name instead. So here I'm going to pass an object with three properties, and I'm going to give it an ID. Let's call it R1, and class name doesn't really matter. We're really not doing any CSS anyway. And the third one, I'll say name, and this one, let's call it CS1520. Okay. So if we do this, let's refresh. Now we can see that this component now has 3 properties: ID and class name, and then name. Now if you look at the elements, you can see that the H1 element here also gets these 3 properties: ID, R1, class, red. Notice that the attribute is class, even though the property name is class name for the reason we just explained, and it also gets name. So these properties, because we simply pass these properties to H1, it gets the same properties as the hello React. Now we can do something different. So let's say that we create another set of properties, and we'll call it h1 props. So this h1 props will be an object, and this one will have an ID of h1, and this one will have a class name, which is the same as this one, and we pass h1 props to this. So instead of simply passing the properties of hello React component to the h1 element, we create a new properties object that has a different ID but same class name, and then pass it to h1. And in addition to that, instead of just say hello React, we'll say hello props name, and now you'll see it says hello CS5220 instead. And if we look at the h1 element again here, notice that this time it only has two attributes, ID and class. It no longer has the third one because we are not passing the same properties object to the h1 element. So this is how we can pass properties and use properties inside React component. And here, for example, if I change the name to hello John, it will say hello John. So as you can see, you can customize the rendered element or rendered component by passing different properties to it. Okay, so now suppose we want to create another component which is slightly more complex than what we have right now. Now this component, let's call it CSULA, and it includes a div element which contains a hello React component, and it also has a hyperlink that links to Cal State LA website, something like that. Now suppose we need to create this using JavaScript. This would be the code to create the component with just plain JavaScript code. As we can see, even for a simple component like this, the code becomes rather unreadable. This is why React comes with some additional syntax called JSX. This is what the example would look like if we write it in JSX. React calls JSX XML syntax extension to JavaScript. So you can think of X as XML or extension or both. As we can see in this example, JSX replaces React create elements, replace React create element method by just writing out the elements directly, both in the definition of the component as well as when the component is rendered. JSX is a fairly simple extension to JavaScript. You just need to know three simple things before you start writing JSX code. This first one we already saw. Instead of using React create element, just write out the element directly. Properties are written as attributes to the element. children are child elements. Also remember that although it looks like HTML, it's actually XML syntax, meaning that, for example, in HTML5, you don't need to close many tags. For example, you don't need to close input tag, and you don't need to close line break tag in HTML5. But with XML syntax, you have to close them. The second thing to know is that you can write elements in one line or multiple lines. If it takes multiple lines, it's recommended to put it in parentheses like this. The third thing is that you can embed JavaScript expression in JSX with braces, curly braces. For example, suppose we have an object called school with properties name and URL. In JSX, we can refer to this object both in attributes and in tag content by embedding them inside braces. Furthermore, JSX prevents injection attacks, so it's safe to embed user input like this. The easy way to understand JSX is to think of it as a mixture of regular JavaScript syntax and XML syntax, and the code basically switches back and forth between these two. Whenever you see an opening tag, it's the start of an XML syntax session. And when you see an opening brace, it switches back to JavaScript. There's a big catch here is that you can only write expression inside braces in the XML section. Take this for example. In this code, it starts as JavaScript up until an opening tag. Once you see an opening tag, you know it's the start of an XML syntax section. And then it's XML up until here, until you see an opening brace, and you'll know that it switched back to JavaScript. And it's JavaScript up until here. There's another opening tag. You'll know that it enters another XML section, and it continues to the closing tag, which means it switches back to JavaScript, and the opening tag. So XML again, XML all the way to closing tag, and then JavaScript again until we reach the closing brace, and then it switches back to XML, and XML until it reaches the closing tag, and afterwards it switches back to JavaScript. So it's really just JavaScript and XML switching back and forth, and the boundaries are opening tag, closing tag, and opening brace and closing brace. By the way, now you can also see why JSX uses XML syntax rather than HTML syntax. In HTML, closing tags are optional for many elements, but in JSX, we need the closing tag to know the end of our XML section. Okay, so now that we know JSX, let's see it in an example. Because browsers only support plain JavaScript, we'll need another library to convert JSX to regular JavaScript. This library is called Babel, which can compile between all kinds of JavaScript versions and variations. For example, you can use it to compile JSX to regular JavaScript, to compile ES6 to ES5, and so on and so forth. There are different ways to use Babel. In a real project, you would want to use Babel to compile your JSX code before including it in a web page. You'll probably also want to use tools like Webpack to package multiple JavaScript files into a single one for better performance. Here, as an example, we'll just link to Babel in the web page, so it does compilation at runtime. It's not good for performance, but this way is simpler for examples. First, let's include the library. I think I lost my mouse again. Okay, it's back. Now, let's link the library. And after we add Babel, it doesn't automatically translate all script sections. We'll have to add a type attribute to the section we wanted to translate. We'll say type is text Babel. So then here we can write our JSX code. So this function now becomes something like this. We'll say return and we'll have a h1, and this h1 will say hello props name, and this h1 will have its own properties, and the ID will be h1 will be the ID property, and class name will be whatever passed to it. So now we don't need this one anymore, and we don't need this one anymore. And here, instead of doing this, we can say render hello React with ID R1, class name red, and name run. And maybe we should something like this. Okay, so why it says $sign John? Oh. Okay, so if we look at the components, still the same thing as before with properties, and if we look at the elements, still the same thing as before. We have the h1 with ID class and so on. So, but as you can see, the code becomes quite a bit more readable than all those create element method calls. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to leave this one as an exercise. If you want create a CSULE component and then render it, and this component uses hello React component and so on. So the code is quite similar to what we have, and it's right here, so you can try it out. Now let's move on to something more important, states. States is basically where all the React magic happens. We've seen properties just a moment ago. Properties are immutable data for a component, meaning once a component is created, its properties don't change. States, on the other hand, are mutable data in a component. More importantly, it's a special type of data, where if some state data changes, React automatically updates the view. To use states in function components, we must use something called hooks. Hooks are special functions that let us use states and other React features without using a class. It was introduced in React 16.8 together with function components, and React provides some built-in hooks like useState and useEffect. In this video, we'll focus on using useState to access states. You can read more about hooks in the React documentation. This is how we can use the useState function. useState returns an array of two items. The first item is a variable holding the data of a state, and the second item is a function to update the state variable, so it's basically a setter. useState takes one argument, which is the initial value of the state. The common practice is to use a so-called destructuring assignment to assign the two items in the returned array to two local variables. So after calling useState, we'll have a variable called URL, whose value is this one, because this one is the initial value for the state. And we'll have a second variable called setURL, and this one is actually a function, and we can use this function later to change the value of URL. Another common practice is to use constants instead of let or var. This makes sure that we cannot just assign a new value to the state variable like URL, is some other URL, and because URL is a constant, we cannot simply do this. Well, if we want to change the value of URL, we'll have to use the setter function returned by useState. Now, let's see an example. Let's create a clock component, which initially looks like this. So this function, of course, creates a React component, and the name of the component is called clock. And we are using the useState hook to create a state variable called time and a setter to change the time. The initial value of the time variable is specified as the argument to useState. So originally, time is a data object and has the current timestamp. And this component will display this time object as a string inside a h2 tag. And here we can render it like this. So now it shows the current time. And Right now it doesn't do much, simply displaying the time, but if we change the time, we'll see that the display will get automatically updated. To make this more like a real clock, we'll try to change the state every second. And to do that, we'll use the setInterval function. SetInterval is a standard JavaScript function, not a React function. It takes two arguments, a function and a delay. Basically, after every delay, it will run the provided function, and it also returns an interval ID, which is a number, and later we can use the interval ID to clear the timer. Otherwise, it will keep going forever. Now, here, once we have our state variable, we can do a setInterval. We can say setInterval, and the interval function will simply set time again with a new date, and we'll do it every 1000 milliseconds, so that's every second. And if we do that, we can see that now it looks like a real clock. It automatically updates the time. And this is how this is the key thing in React, is that you describe the UI and you attach data, in particular states, to the UI. And if you later on want to change the UI, you no longer need to manipulate DOM directly. You'll simply set a new state, and React automatically updates the display for you. From this example, we can also see another difference between property and the state. Properties are set by something outside the component, usually the parent component, for example, here. The something outside pass a properties object to Hello React, and then Hello React also sets the properties of its child components or child elements. States, on the other hand, are initialized and updated inside the component. It's completely inside here. And this way, each component is self-contained, so its state does not rely on something outside. Now, of course, we can't always use setInterval to change the state of a component. There must be some other way. And as you can probably guess, the most common way to change state is to do it when some event happens. For example, we could add some event handling code to our clock to start and stop it. The way we'll do it is we'll add a onClick handler to the clock component, to the H2 component. And when that H2 component is clicked, we'll either start the clock if it's not started yet, or we'll stop it if it's already started. Now, there are two things when it comes to event handling. A, how do you create the event handler, and B, how do you attach it to event. This is what event handling code generally looks like in React. So you would have some element, and just like in JavaScript, the event is an attribute on that element, usually called on something, like on click, on mouse over, on double click, and so on. And then you just put the event handler here, which is a function, and this function takes an argument, which is an event object. Now, the first thing we need to know is what exactly are the events that we can attach event handler to, and the answer is all the DOM events. If you look at the DOM specification, you'll see that it defines lots of events. Things like, well, let me just things like on click, on double click, on mouse out, mouse down, mouse up, and so on and so forth. So I guess we can also see it on this side. So all those DOM events are supported by React. The difference, however, is that when you write HTML code, those attributes look like this. They will say on click or on double click and so on, so all lowercase. Now, in React, we need to change that to camel case, meaning that the first letter is still lowercase, but after that, each word, the first letter in each word is capitalized. If you are unsure about the capitalization or whether the event name has changed a little bit or not, then a safer way to look up all the supported events is to look at the supported events section in the documentation. For example, if we look at mouse events, we can see that in React, we can do on click, on context menu, probably the right button click, and on double click, on drag, and so on and so forth. There are a whole bunch of them. So this is the event that we can attach our event handler to, and then each event handler will get an event object. You can use it or you can ignore it, but if you use it, know that this event object is known something as a synthetic event object, meaning that it's a React wrapper that wrap around the browser's native event. What it does is, regardless of what browser you use, it will ensure that the event object will provide a consistent API that is compliant with W3C specifications. So, knowing all that, let's do our event handling thing. And so we'll create a function inside our clock component, and we'll call it start and stop, or I'll call it toggle clock. So what this one does is it will check whether the clock is started or not currently, and the way we do that is by check if there's a interval ID. So let's say we don't have an interval ID, and let's say we have a think we don't even need to do that. This should be undefined. Now, if we don't have an interval ID, that means the clock hasn't started yet, and so we'll do interval ID. So this one is if we have interval ID and if we don't. So if we don't, we'll set an interval and we'll do interval. Yeah, we'll call set interval and we'll set the interval ID to. We'll set the return value to interval ID. Yeah, something like that. Yes. Oh, and before that, we also actually need to change the state. Yeah. No, we don't need to change the state. Okay, so this one is okay. And then if we do have an interval ID, then we'll need to use clear interval to remove it. Yeah. So we'll say clear interval ID, something like this. Okay, so once we clear the interval, we'll need to set interval ID to null, so that next time if we click, we'll know it's stopped. Yeah, something like that. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll figure something out. Okay, so now we have our event handler, and then we can attach this to the onClick event, and now we'll pass this function as the event handler, and yeah, let's see what it looks like. We'll refresh, and now it's not running the clock if I click on it. Okay, so now it starts running, and if I click on it again, it stopped. Click on it again, it starts again. Click on it, stopped. Okay, so it works. Great. So in our example, this event handler actually doesn't use the event object, but that's okay. Again, this is a nice thing about JavaScript, is that your function will be passed the argument, but you can decide whether you want to use it or not. Okay, so that pretty much covers the basics about React, from creating React elements, components, to setting properties, to use states, to use event handlers to change states. There are some books on Safari books online that you can check out and look at several of them, and one that I liked the most is this book called Learning React version 2nd edition by Posello and Banks. This is a very good book. It's not the easiest to read. It does the writing takes a bit used to, but the content is really good. So if you are serious about learning React, I highly recommend that you take a look at this book. Okay, so this is the end of this video. See you in the next one.